I remember the moment the first pale light slipped into the canyon. We had been surrounded all night, those strange whispers and shuffling footsteps still echoing in my head. Jake kept shivering against me, and I knew if I didn't act now, we wouldn't survive until the sun fully rose. I pulled the emergency whistle from my pack. My breath caught in my chest. A piercing blast cut through the heavy air of the Appalachian forest. At the same time, I struck the flare. A burst of red fire lit up the trees, throwing twisted shadows across the wet trunks, turning the shapes in the woods into distorted figures. In that brief chaos, I grabbed Jake's hand and dragged him upstream. My heart pounded like a war drum, the flickering flare reflecting off the water as if 1,000 eyes were watching us. Behind us, I heard those cries again, half human, half animal, but no longer steady. They were caught off guard. We stumbled over slick rocks, branches clawing at our clothes, our breath steaming in the freezing air. But we had bought a few precious seconds. As the light grew stronger, we spotted a narrow game trail climbing up toward the ridge. When my feet finally hit the familiar stretch of dirt leading to our car, I let myself believe we might make it out alive. But even as the engine roared to life, I still heard the calls echoing from the valley broken, lingering like a reminder that we had seen something we were never meant to see. By the time our car rolled into the small town, Jake's hand was still trembling in mine. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office. My mind kept replaying the images, the dark river, the pale bodies in the water, that guttural language twisting through the trees. I sat across from a deputy and told him everything. My voice was raw as I described the footsteps in the night, the glowing eyes caught on my camera, the scene in the river where they scrubbed raw flesh in the current. I handed over memory cards, photos, every detail I could recall. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, nodding with a detached expression. Then he said flatly, "Probably just some marijuana growers, or a few guys cooking meth. Happens around here." That answer hit colder than the mountain air. I wanted to shout that no drug crew moves like predators in the night. No meth cook surrounds a family's campsite with whispers and screams. But when I looked into those indifferent eyes, I realized he would never believe me. To him, my story was nothing more than superstition, or worse, a joke. I walked out of that office feeling like I had just sent a distress signal into empty space. No one answered, no one wanted to. And that silence, heavier than any voice in the woods, followed me longer than the whispers that had haunted the dark. 6 weeks later, I heard the news that still twists my stomach to this day. A missing hiker had been found, right at the same stretch of river where Jake and I had witnessed that horrifying scene. The report described a badly decomposed body, but what haunted me most was the statement from the search team. The evidence didn't look like it was caused by wild animals. There were cuts, there were marks, everything pointed to human hands. I remembered the beam of my flashlight on the water, those dark red pieces being scrubbed against the rocks by bare hands. And as I read the news, I knew with absolute certainty I hadn't been wrong. What Jake and I saw that night was real. That death was a gruesome confirmation, a truth no law officer dared to name. For me, it proved one thing. Those people weren't ghosts, and they weren't hallucinations. They existed. They lived right there in Appalachia, and they weren't afraid to turn human beings into their food source. When the media covered the expanded search after that discovery, I read every word, cold sweat running down my back. The rescue team hadn't only found the body, they also uncovered signs of a primitive life hidden in the very forest I once believed was untouched and safe. Burned out fire pits, makeshift shelters built from branches and animal skins, and in stone crevices, they found stashes of crude tools, stone blades, wooden bowls, rusted hooks. It all proved that people had been living out there, not for days, not even for years, but for generations. Experts called them outsiders, people who had abandoned civilization and chosen to vanish into the wilderness. But when I remembered those long fingers pressed against the glass, that half-human, half-animal language, and those eyes glowing in the dark, the word people no longer felt right. I realized that what Jake and I had encountered wasn't just a folktale. They had camps, they had tools, they had a society. They were real, and they were still there in Appalachia, a dark piece of history that never went away. From that night on, I never looked at the forest the same. Before, I worried about black bears, snakes, flash floods. Now, whenever I thought of Appalachia, I saw those pale figures gliding between the trees, eyes glowing, voices twisting into something broken and wrong. I warn anyone thinking of fishing or camping deep in the backcountry. The most dangerous predator in the woods isn't the wildlife. It's the people who've abandoned law and morality, who've lived so long in the shadows, they've forgotten what it means to be human. Jake and I never went back to that river, and I know we never will. For outsiders, it may still look like a paradise for fishing. But for me, it will forever be a nightmare. The place where I learned that the line between man and beast can vanish completely in one dark corner of Appalachia. The first time I brought Jake to that stretch of the Cumberland River, I thought I had found a cathedral of nature. The river bent through a narrow valley, pressed up against a massive limestone bluff. Towering hemlock trees stretched their dark green canopy across the sky, forming a natural dome that allowed only thin shafts of sunlight to fall onto the water. The current ran cold year-round, so clear I could see schools of trout gliding beneath my feet. The sound of water, trickling over stones, mixed with the calls of forest birds, created a kind of music that washed away every worry of daily life. In that moment, Jake and I just sat still, soaking in the absolute peace, a place I foolishly believed was a perfect refuge, untouched by the world beyond. I didn't know then that the silence itself was hiding whispers we would hear later, sounds that didn't belong to nature, but had lingered in those woods long before we arrived. After the divorce, my time with Jake became rare and precious. That's why our fishing trips to the Cumberland turned into a tradition, one we held onto for 5 years straight. Every summer, we'd pack our rods in a small tent, then hike 3 miles through rough terrain to reach the cold, clear water. It wasn't just about catching fish. It was about watching my son grow older with each passing season, and about finding a kind of peace that city life could never offer us. In the quiet of the mountains, the sound of flowing water and bird calls became the soundtrack for our talks. Sometimes short conversations, sometimes comfortable silence. At night, we'd sit by the fire, eating trout we had caught ourselves, and for a little while the rest of the world felt like it didn't exist. I once believed those trips were the strongest bond I could build with Jake, a sanctuary from stress and routine. But looking back now, I shiver at the thought. Maybe even in those peaceful years, unseen eyes were already watching us from the trees, waiting silently for the moment we wandered too far into their territory. That first night went by just like all the others. Jake and I sat by the riverbank, casting into the still, deep water. The brook trout bit quickly, enough for us to cook a simple, warm meal. The campfire crackled, casting a golden glow on my son's face. We ate and talked, sharing scattered stories about school, about friends, about hazy dreams for the future. It was the kind of moment I knew I would treasure forever, because it was rare, fragile, and more valuable than anything else. Around 10 o'clock, we put out the fire and crawled into the tent. The night wind funneled through the canyon, carrying that sharp Appalachian chill. I listened to the steady flow of the river below, the insects humming like a lullaby. Everything felt so peaceful, I was certain this trip would become another cherished memory. But in that ordinary quiet, unseen figures may have already been standing out there in the forest, and we, my son and I, had no idea we were about to step into a nightmare. I jolted awake when Jake shook my shoulder. His whisper was urgent, though he tried to keep it low. "Dad, there's something in the river." In the heavy darkness of Appalachia, I listened. At first, it was just the sound of water slapping, like a big fish breaking the surface. But soon, the rhythm changed too loud, too uneven, like someone walking through the current. I strained harder, and when the wind shifted, another sound slipped in. Voices. Not English, not any language I recognized. The cadence rose and fell like whispered speech, but stretched with guttural growls and warped hisses, something both familiar and alien. My heartbeat pounded in my chest. Inside that thin tent, with only the faint glow of dying coals outside, I couldn't see a thing. Only the sound poured in, drilling into my ears like a code from another world. Jake gripped my hand, trembling. I had no answer for him. All I could do was sit there, listening to the river's slap and those strange voices whispering through the night, seeping through the fabric walls, as if they were standing just outside, watching us. I motioned for Jake to stay in the tent. His hand clung to my sleeve, refusing to let go. I whispered reassurance, then pulled the LED flashlight from my pack. The moment I pressed the switch, a harsh white beam cut into my palm, strong enough to steady me yet terrifying. because I knew it meant I was about to confront whatever waited outside. I eased the zipper down and slipped out. The cold air struck my skin instantly, carrying the damp rot of the forest floor and the resinous scent of hemlock trees. In the distance, the river slapped again, slow and heavy, as if something large moved deliberately through the water. I stepped forward carefully, my boots pressing into the wet carpet of leaves with a crackling sound that made me flinch. I killed the beam, then flicked it back on in quick bursts, trying not to give myself away. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Hurried whispers laced with low growls, answering each other in deliberate rhythm. Rising mist curled up from the river, catching the light in silver ribbons that twisted in the darkness, warping the scene into something unearthly. I crouched behind a massive boulder, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. And there, just a few yards across the water, I knew I was about to see something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I drew a deep breath, my hand trembling as I aimed the LED beam across the river. The cold light sliced through the night, and in that instant, my heart nearly stopped. 3 figures stood in the freezing current, completely naked. Their pale skin glistened in the broken reflections of the river. There was no sign that they felt the icy air that was cutting straight through my own lungs. They bent low, sinewy arms, gripping slabs of raw, crimson flesh, pressing it against the rushing water. Their movements were rhythmic, scrubbing away each streak of blood, each trace of tissue. The current ran red, then cleared, only for their hands to repeat the motion again and again. I couldn't fool myself into believing it was fish or game. The way they worked, one holding firm, another washing, a third inspecting, was like a practiced assembly line. No hesitation, no confusion, just precision. The strange whispers carried between them, clipped sounds in call and response. It wasn't random chatter, it was command. It was structure. Proof this wasn't the first time they had done this. I froze behind the rock, the flashlight quivering in my hand, and a horrifying truth settled in. My son and I weren't witnessing survival. We were watching a ritual, something far too dark to be called human. The longer I watched, the more disturbing it became. They moved in unison, like gears in a machine. One braced the flesh in the current, another scrubbed it with calloused hands, and the last inspected every surface before signaling to the others with a curt nod. Their voices threaded through the icy air, mingling with the sound of rushing water. Not conversation, not nonsense. Orders, signals. A harsh string of guttural sounds, half human, half animal, repeated with deliberate rhythm, a language all their own. A chill ran through me. These weren't 3 wanderers scraping by in the woods. This was a community, a structured group with roles, hierarchy, and a way to communicate. Every movement radiated cold expertise, as if they had done this countless times before. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just stumbled onto something strange. I had found proof of another society hidden deep in the forest, beyond the reach of law, existing alongside us, but belonging to something that could never be called human. My eyes were still fixed on the 3 figures in the river when I felt a sudden grip on my shoulder. Jake. He was trembling violently. His eyes stretched wide in a way I had never seen before, and he pointed behind me. Through the dense Appalachian darkness, shapes were sliding silently between the trees. No snapping branches, no rustling leaves. Just gaunt figures gliding as if the night itself was part of their skin. I spun around, heart hammering. In the weak spill of my flashlight, I caught flashes of eyes reflecting back, glowing for a split second before vanishing. One pair, then another, then more blocking the path back to our camp. My throat went dry. I understood immediately. We'd been discovered. We weren't silent observers anymore, we were prey, surrounded by beings who knew every tree, every hidden trail of this forest. Jake clutched my arm, his lips moving but no sound coming out. He didn't need to speak. In his eyes, I saw the same truth I already knew. We had walked straight into their territory, and they weren't about to let us leave. The splashing in the river suddenly stopped. Then, from the middle of the current, a scream ripped through the night. It echoed sharp and high, half human, half animal, stretched into a sound that made my skin crawl. In the silence that followed, the forest answered. From every direction came guttural calls, distorted hisses, broken cries. They bounced off the canyon walls, clashing together in a grotesque chorus, turning the narrow valley into an echo chamber of sounds no human throat should make. Jake clung to my arm, gasping. His hand was icy cold, sweat dripping even in the cutting mountain air. I knew what that first scream meant. It was a signal, and every response from the woods was an answer. We weren't being followed anymore. We had officially become the hunted. The entire forest seemed to be breathing down on us, preparing for the chase. I squeezed Jake's hand and yanked him forward. We sprinted toward camp, minds locked on the tent, on the trail that would take us back to the car. But after only a few dozen steps, my flashlight swung across the trees and froze. There, standing dead still on the same path we had hiked yesterday, was a figure, thin, motionless, its eyes glinting like an animal's in the beam. Then, behind us, came the heavy rhythm of synchronized footsteps. We were surrounded. There was no choice. I dragged Jake sideways, down toward the riverbank. The freezing water splashed against our shoes, slippery stones nearly sending us sprawling. My breath tore out of me in ragged bursts, heart pounding like a hammer, blood roaring in my ears as screams echoed through the forest. We ran along the river's edge, the water a black ribbon beside us. My flashlight wavered, its beam slicing across wet trees dripping with night fog, stretching their shadows into long, reaching arms that seemed ready to snatch us. Behind us, shouts and calls echoed, answering one another in a pattern. They were moving fast, coordinating like a pack of hunters, and we were nothing more than prey being herded into a dead end. The footsteps grew louder. They didn't sound like people crashing through the woods, no stumbling, no hesitation. Their bodies flowed through the darkness like predators built for the night. I whipped the beam behind me. For a split second, the light caught wiry figures darting between trees, crouching low and springing forward with terrifying agility. But the moment the beam touched them, they vanished again, leaving only the suffocating dark and the pounding of my own breath. What froze my blood wasn't just their speed, it was their coordination. A call rang out from the left, immediately answered from the right. A sharp hiss echoed from far away, only to be replied to by one alarmingly close, right by my ear. They were talking to each other, a system of signals designed for hunting in the dark. In that moment, I understood. We were being driven, herded like cornered animals, and those things, they didn't need light or maps. The forest was theirs. Jake stumbled, nearly collapsing on a slick stone. I yanked him up, my heart hammering. My mind locked on a single thought: find cover before the circle closed around us. Through the blur of panic, I spotted a rockfall near the riverbank. The collapse had left a narrow hollow, just wide enough for two people to squeeze into. I dragged Jake, and we crawled inside like drowning men clawing at a lifeline. The space was cramped, reeking of damp soil and moss. I pressed myself against the entrance, one hand gripping the flashlight, the other clutching the emergency flare. My fingers trembled, but I forced myself to hold steady, ready to light and throw if any figure appeared. Outside, the calls still rang out, relentless, like the blaring of hunting horns. Every so often, I could hear footsteps crushing dry leaves, no more than a few dozen paces away. I dimmed the flashlight to nothing, hiding the glow. Darkness closed in, pressing tight, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears like war drums. Jake curled against me, wide-eyed, clutching my arm. I held him close and whispered just one thing: don't make a sound. In that moment, I realized this narrow crack of stone was the only barrier between us and the pack circling outside. And if they found us, I had only two weapons left: a single burst of light and the instinct to survive. We huddled together inside the crack of stone, and that's when I realized the worst truth of all. They weren't in a hurry to attack. Instead, they were circling us, hunters who knew exactly how to play a waiting game. Footsteps echoed from every direction. Sometimes they drifted faintly, as if bouncing off the canyon walls. Other times, they pressed so close I could hear the sharp snap of twigs beneath their feet. They moved in rhythm, shifting places again and again, as if weaving a tightening circle around our fragile shelter. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the movement, it was the voices. That strange language murmured through the night, breaking into fragments, half whispers, half growls. At times it sounded like they were calling to each other, at others, as if they were holding a discussion. The noises bled into the Appalachian darkness, tangled with wind and water, leaving me chilled with the sense that they were talking about us. Jake buried his face against my shoulder, trembling. All I could do was hold him tight, My eyes locked on the black entrance, where at any moment a face could appear. That night stretched on forever. Each passing minute felt like a suspended sentence, and I knew with absolute clarity we had been marked. The only reason we were still alive was because they were waiting for the right moment to end the hunt. I remember clearly the moment the first pale light slipped into the canyon. We had been surrounded all night, the strange whispers and dragging footsteps still echoing in my head. Jake trembled against me, and I knew that if I didn't act immediately, we wouldn't survive until the sun fully rose. I pulled the emergency whistle from my pack. My breath caught in my chest. A piercing blast tore through the heavy air of the Appalachian forest. At the same time, I struck the flare. A burst of red fire shot upward, casting twisted shadows across the wet tree trunks, turning the shapes in the woods into warped illusions. In that brief chaos, I grabbed Jake's hand and dragged him upstream. My heart pounded like a war drum, the flickering flare reflecting off the water like 1,000 eyes watching us. Behind us, the cries rose again, half human, half animal, but this time they weren't steady. They had been caught off guard. We slipped on slick rocks. Branches lashed at our clothes, our breath pouring out in clouds in the freezing air. But at least we had bought a few precious seconds. As the light grew stronger, we spotted a narrow game trail climbing toward the ridge. When my feet finally hit the familiar stretch of dirt leading back to the car, I allowed myself to believe we might make it out alive. But even as the engine roared, I could still hear the calls echoing from the valley broken, lingering like a reminder that we had seen something we were never meant to see. I can still remember that October morning in 2020 with perfect clarity. The air was cool, thin fog hanging over the suburban roads of Richmond as I packed my car to the brim. My camera, maps, compass, GPS, tent, and enough food for 3 days, all carefully prepared for what I believed would be nothing more than a simple fall photography trip. My goal was clear: to head deep into George Washington National Forest, where the old-growth trees were at their most brilliant. I wanted to capture those fleeting moments when light streamed through a canopy of red and gold leaves, scattering down onto the damp forest floor scenes you'd never find in the city. As I drove, I felt a strange exhilaration, almost like I was entering some private ritual 3 days with nothing but me, my camera, and the wild. I had done dozens of trips before, but this time there was something different, something I couldn't quite name, almost as if the forest was waiting for me, patient and silent. I wasn't reckless. By then, I had already completed countless solo treks across the eastern U.S. from the Blue Ridge Mountains to the harsher backwoods of Pennsylvania. I knew how to read terrain, pitch a tent in freezing rain, and stay calm when the forest swallowed all light after dusk. In my pack, alongside my camera, I carried everything an experienced hiker should: GPS units, a detailed topographical map marked with every contour, a compass, a first aid kit, even an emergency beacon I'd never once had to activate. I believed I was ready for anything. That confidence felt like a protective shell, and it made me stride deeper into the woods with ease. What I didn't know then was that within days, those tools I trusted would turn into dead weight, and I would find myself inside a maze of shadows, where logic and survival instinct would collide. That morning, I parked at a familiar trailhead. The sky was clear, sunlight piercing through the thinning fog and casting long beams across a carpet of fallen leaves. I tightened my pack, double-checked my camera, and stepped onto the trail with a sense of calm control. The first 8 miles were uneventful. The main path was well-trodden, firm underfoot, with fresh boot prints guiding the way. I stopped often, taking photos of golden light sliding down the trunks of ancient trees, listening to the faint trickle of a stream somewhere beyond, blending with the whisper of wind through the canopy. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I had expected, just like so many trips before. But then I reached a fork, where a narrow side path split from the main trail. I turned onto it. The ground softened under my boots, damp with leaf mold, and the canopy grew heavier. Branches clawed low across my path, forcing me to duck and weave. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, until it felt like the forest itself was swallowing sound. At the time, I thought that silence was exactly what I had come for, the isolation I needed to capture something rare with my lens. I didn't yet realize that silence was also a warning. I didn't realize it at the time, but that single decision to step off the familiar trail was the moment my nightmare began. The moment that would make me question every survival skill I thought I had mastered. The instant I entered that little used path, it felt like I had crossed into another world. Towering old-growth trees rose dozens of feet into the air, their trunks wrapped in thick green moss. The canopy locked together so tightly above me that the sunlight only managed to break through in thin silver threads that dangled in the air like strands of silk. The smell of damp soil mixed with resin and rotting leaves pressed down heavy on the air. I stopped often, raising my camera to capture the twisted trunks arching like columns in an ancient cathedral. Wind sighed through the branches, producing a hollow resonance, like some forgotten organ playing a low, steady note. It felt perfect for photography. No hikers, no engines, no trace of danger. I even told myself, this is why I came here. I believed I had found my own hidden sanctuary, a pocket of wilderness frozen in time, waiting only for me and my lens. I couldn't have known that this very silence was concealing something I'd spend the rest of my life shuddering to remember. In my pack, I carried everything a 3-day trip demanded. Enough food for 4 days as backup, a lightweight tent, my portable stove, spare batteries, and every piece of camera equipment I had meticulously prepared. Each item had its place, neatly arranged, as if I were rehearsing a script for the perfect expedition. For years, I had taken dozens of solo trips just like this, and not once had I ever been lost. I trusted my skills, my maps, my GPS, and above all, the calm mindset I'd cultivated with every trek into the backcountry. To me, getting lost was something that happened only to the careless, to those who didn't prepare. But this time, that confidence began to erode, one small detail at a time. I would soon learn that sometimes, all it takes is a canopy thick enough to block the sky, and every piece of technology, every ounce of experience, can become worthless. At first, I didn't notice anything wrong. My GPS unit blinked steadily in my hand, but the signal wavered under the heavy canopy. The cursor drifted, skipping a few feet this way, a few feet that way. I shrugged it off as normal interference in the forest, but the errors piled up. A faint fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. A shallow slope pulling me away from my original heading. I stopped, unfolded my paper map, and compared but the world around me. Endless mossy trunks, damp rock, and shadowed soil didn't match a single contour line or landmark. I told myself, just a little farther and I'll recognize something familiar. But every step only deepened the unfamiliar. The forest grew denser, the shapes more distorted, and the paths, if they were paths at all, faded into nothing, leaving me surrounded by a maze where everything looked the same. In that moment, I began to understand that my confidence was being tested for real. This was no longer just another hike. By Friday evening, the truth hit me like a slab of ice. I stood in the middle of thick forest, maps spread across my hands, but nothing around me. The endless trunks, the carpet of rotting leaves, the moss-covered rocks matched any of the symbols printed on paper. I spun my compass, checked my GPS again. The screen jumped erratically, showing different positions every few seconds. The faint trail I had followed was gone, swallowed by darkness and trees closing in behind me. There wasn't a single sign that another person had ever passed this way. A heavy sense of isolation clamped down on my chest. The wind rattling through the canopy sounded like whispers, while the insects drummed from every direction until the noise thickened into a wall of sound that only made me feel more lost. For the first time in all my years in the wilderness, I had to admit it. I was lost. Not just a slight detour I could correct, but truly, hopelessly disoriented inside an endless green maze. I decided to stop moving. Pushing on through the dark would only drive me deeper into this labyrinth. Following the survival training I'd learned years before, I searched for a small clearing where the canopy was thin enough for search aircraft to possibly spot me from above. I pitched my lightweight tent, securing it to the damp soil with makeshift stakes, then gathered dry branches to build a small fire. The flames flickered weakly, not nearly enough to chase away the Appalachian chill, but at least they gave me the fragile illusion of control. I reminded myself, I had told friends my route. If I wasn't back by Sunday, they'd alert search and rescue. Planes would begin sweeping the area. I just had to hold out. When I looked up, the sky above was a suffocating void. No moon, no stars. Just a restless canopy shifting like a massive black curtain. I closed my eyes and clung to the crackle of the fire, whispering to myself that maybe, just maybe, This faint glow would be enough to catch someone's eye from the skies above. Saturday morning, the forest pressed down with a gray weight. I barely had time to stoke the fire before the wind roared, tearing through the trees with a cold bite that sank through every layer of clothing. Then, the hail began. Sharp stones pounded the nylon roof of my tent, hammering the ground into thick mud. I curled tight inside my sleeping bag, clutching my backpack close to keep the water out, clinging to every ounce of warmth I could trap. I had packed enough food for 4 days, but in these conditions, I was forced to ration as tightly as possible. A handful of granola, a few sips of water, then stillness. Just me in the cramped dark, listening to the wind howl and the hail drumming the forest like a war chant. The world outside was so thick with mist that I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. Every time the wind tore through, I felt like my tent was about to be ripped straight from the ground. The only thing keeping me from sinking into despair was the thought that the storm would eventually pass, and maybe, just maybe, tomorrow, the sky would clear enough for me to find a way out or signal for help. By Sunday morning, I sat inside my soaked tent, staring at the food bag that was nearly empty. Only a couple of energy bars and a handful of dried nuts remained enough to last one more day. After that, nothing. For 2.5 days, I had clung to hope, straining to hear the thrum of helicopter blades or see the beam of a search team's light cutting through the trees. But the forest offered nothing but the endless sound of wind rushing through the canopy and water dripping from rain-soaked branches. There was no sign that anyone was coming. The weight of helplessness pressed down on my chest. I knew the truth. If I stayed here, I would run out of strength long before rescuers ever found me. The only choice left was to leave camp, step back into the forest, and gamble everything on finding my own way out. I unfolded the map, checked my compass again, and shoved everything into my pack. My hand trembled as I pulled the zipper closed, because I knew I was abandoning the one defensive position I had. But one thought kept repeating in my head. If I don't move, I'll never get out of here. I stumbled up a muddy slope, feet sliding out from under me, and then froze. Ahead of me, tucked into a narrow valley between two ridges, was a sight that made my heart slam in my chest. Deep in the forest, where every map claimed there was nothing but untouched wilderness, stood a shelter. Its walls were stacked stone, carefully fitted together, with moss and earth packed into the gaps. Above it stretched a roof, woven from heavy branches, and covered in thick, weathered animal hides, darkened by time and storms. It looked nothing like the makeshift lean-tos or hunting camps I'd seen before. This was built to last. A structure made for long-term living, crafted with patience and skill, yet completely primitive. No nails, no canvas, no trace of modern materials. I stood frozen, hope and dread colliding inside me. Part of me wanted to believe that whoever lived here could help me, but a cold shiver ran down my spine at the same time. Because if someone truly lived here, they had chosen to cut themselves off from the world, and I had no way of knowing if a stranger like me would be welcomed or driven away. I stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate. My eyes locked on the shadowed entrance, and then I saw the details hanging just outside, and the bottom dropped out of my stomach. On wooden stakes driven into the ground, someone had hung rows of bleached animal skulls, bird feathers trailing in the wind, and strips of dried hide curling in the damp air. They weren't arranged at random, they formed a deliberate arch, like a gateway to some kind of ritual. Worse still, among the primitive decorations I saw things that didn't belong here at all. A torn strip of nylon, clearly once part of a modern hiking pack, had been woven into a wind chime made of bones. A shard of plastic from a camp food container peeked out from under a string of feathers. Even a piece of rusted metal, what looked like part of a folding knife or camping tool, had been fixed right in the center, displayed as if it were something valuable. My breath caught in my throat. The sight pointed to one chilling possibility. I wasn't the first lost hiker to stumble into this place, and whoever came before me had somehow left pieces of their lives behind, now transformed into trophies hanging in this grim display. The realization hit me hard. These scraps of nylon, plastic, and metal hadn't just appeared here on their own. They had belonged to someone like me. I stood frozen, heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my ears. A thought crept in, cold as ice. If those items weren't scavenged from gear left behind, maybe the people who carried them never walked out of this forest. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me. The animal skulls, the feathers, the hides, All of it suddenly felt less like decoration and more like a silent warning. It was as if I had stepped into a place marked by others before me, others who never found their way back. I had just begun to back away when I heard it faint at first, drifting from inside the stone shelter. A rustle, a subtle shift, then the undeniable sound of something or someone stirring. Every muscle in my body locked. Instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I pressed myself against the trunk of a massive oak, holding my breath, eyes locked on the shadowed doorway. The silence thickened. The wind through the canopy hissed like distant whispers. My flashlight felt like a weight of iron in my hand, but I didn't dare switch it on, afraid the beam would betray me. All I could do was wait. Wait to see what stepped out of that darkness, something that would decide whether I ever made it back to the world outside. From within the gloom, a figure finally emerged, hunched and deliberate. The dim light filtering through the branches fell across his form, and in an instant I knew I was looking at something entirely out of the ordinary. He wore crude clothing stitched together from animal hides, the seams held with plant fibers, decorated with dangling bones and feathers like primitive ornaments. His hair was long, tangled, matted into ropes that fell across his shoulders. His skin was darkened, toughened, as if it had weathered a lifetime exposed to the raw wind and rain of the mountains. But it was his movements that truly stole my breath. He didn't move like any normal man. His body flowed with a predatory grace, every step deliberate, every tilt of the head radiating a raw, animal awareness, as if his eyes and ears could sense things far beyond my own limits. I pressed a trembling hand against my mouth, terrified even my breath might give me away. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I was looking at a man or something that had already crossed the line of being human. He crouched low, calloused fingers brushing over the damp forest floor like a seasoned tracker. Every footprint, every blade of grass bent out of place. He stopped, touched, sniffed, then moved on with unnerving precision. I caught the glint of his eyes, cold, sharp, predatory, like those of a creature born to hunt the night. He followed a set of fresh prints, circled a thicket, then froze. Slowly, he lifted his head. My chest tightened as his gaze snapped toward me. It wasn't random. It wasn't a guess. His eyes locked on the exact tree where I was hiding, cutting through bark and shadow as if he'd known all along. My breath hitched. Cold sweat slid down my spine. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was prey. Then came his voice, a low, guttural growl at first, before breaking into warped fragments of English. "Come. Stay." The sound rolled through the forest, something not entirely human. What followed was stranger still, a string of jagged syllables, part hiss, part grunt, twisted into a language only the dark could understand. He repeated it again and again, louder, faster, as if his call left me no option but to answer. And then he started toward me. Not rushing, but moving with the steady confidence of someone who owned this place, weaving through the trees with fluid, animal poise. His eyes never left the spot where I hid. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. Every sound he made straddled the line between invitation and command. I knew if I didn't act, if I didn't make a choice, he'd be standing right in front of me within seconds. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as stone. Hiding any longer would only make things worse. Drawing in a breath that shook in my chest, I stepped out from behind the tree, raising my hands with palms open to show I carried no weapon. My voice wavered, but I forced it steady. I'm lost. I don't mean to intrude. I just need to find a way out. The sound of my own words tore through the silence of that forest, harsh and foreign, as if I had just broken into a world that didn't belong to me. He stopped, head tilted, his eyes sweeping over me as if weighing and measuring. Then came the sounds again, strange, broken syllables laced with fragments of English. Safe, food, stay, family. He raised a hand, beckoning toward the stone shelter. The gesture was so eager I couldn't tell if it was an invitation or a command. In that moment, I felt like a specimen under a microscope, watched, assessed, and judged. When I finished speaking, his expression lit up like a child, finding a long-lost toy. He nodded quickly, muttering that half-human, half-animal language, then suddenly slipped in more fractured English. Good, stay, family, safe. His arm swept toward the shelter, his voice spilling out faster and faster until I could only catch fragments. Others, before, stay, not alone. My stomach dropped. Others? Family? He was saying that people like me, other lost hikers, had once stood in this very spot, and then chosen to stay with him? His smile wasn't threatening. It was almost joyful, urgent, as though he was thrilled at the chance to welcome another member into something he called family. And yet, that very excitement twisted my gut with dread. In those gleaming eyes, I didn't see pity for a lost traveler. I saw the strange delight of someone preparing to usher me into a family I had no wish to meet. I edged back half a step, forcing a thin, brittle smile. Deep inside, a chill ran the length of my spine. He wasn't just inviting me, he was expecting me. Expecting me to nod, to step across the threshold of that stone shelter, to join the family he spoke of. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Once I stepped in, I would never step out again. I drew a shaky breath, lifted a hand in thanks, and shook my head gently. No, I can't stay. Just road. Please, show me road. The light in his eyes extinguished. The eager grin collapsed into visible disappointment. He lowered his head, muttering in that broken tongue, then lifted his gaze again, this time filled with worry and suspicion. The air thickened. In that instant, I felt as if I were walking a razor's edge. One wrong word, one wrong move, and I might never leave that forest alive. His face darkened, eyes flickering with both regret and suspicion. After a long silence, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the distant ridge, his finger cutting across the horizon. His voice came out fractured, mixing broken English with those half-human, half-animal sounds. Hard, road, up, ridge, but careful, hungry ones, night hunters. The last words landed heavy, each syllable pressed hard like they were meant to be carved into my memory. Hungry ones, night hunters. The echoes hammered inside my skull like knuckles rapping on hollow wood. I nodded, whispered my thanks, and slowly backed away, palms slick with sweat. But just as I turned, his voice rose again behind me, louder, more urgent, like a reminder or a summons I couldn't begin to understand. I didn't dare look back. Those words clung to me all the way up the slick incline, as if the hungry ones and night hunters he spoke of were already circling, waiting for the fall of night to reveal themselves. I forced myself to follow the landmarks he'd given. Every step up the damp ridge felt like walking on borrowed time. By late afternoon, through the last thick wall of trees, I finally saw it, a wide dirt road, a Forest Service track cutting through the wilderness. My knees nearly buckled when headlights blinked around the bend. A maintenance truck slowed, the driver's eyes going wide at the sight of a soaked, pale-faced woman staggering out of the forest. I raised my arm, voice cracking. Help, please. I had been missing for 4 days. Search and rescue crews had been preparing to launch a full-scale operation the next morning. In the truck, I gave my coordinates, describing the primitive shelter and the strange inhabitant I had met deep in the woods. But when rangers hiked out weeks later, everything was gone. The shelter dismantled, fire pits erased, every trace carefully wiped away, as if it had never existed. I can't shake the thought that they have a way of warning one another, some hidden network woven through the forest, enough to let them vanish before outsiders can close in. And the most haunting question of all still lingers. If I had nodded that day, if I had accepted the offer to stay, would I even be here to tell this story now? I remember that morning vividly. The mountain mist still clung to the ground in thin streaks, like smoke drifting over the cold earth. The roar of our pickup trucks echoed down the winding dirt road, shattering the silence that usually ruled the forests of Western Virginia. There were 4 of us: Mark Stevens, the unquestioned leader, a contractor by trade, and Brian Walsh, Tom Martinez, and Jeff Cooper, my childhood friends who had been with me through everything. For over 15 years, we'd kept this tradition alive, 1 week every November. We'd leave behind our jobs, our families, and escape into the wild. Out there, it was just hunting, beer by the fire, and the illusion of freedom. Back then, the woods felt like nothing more than a refuge. I didn't realize that this trip would carve the darkest memory of my life. In 2021, we chose a place unlike any before, a private stretch of forest covering nearly 2,000 acres, hidden deep in the coal country mountains near the Kentucky border. I can still feel the way the truck jolted over the broken dirt road, potholes stacked on potholes, each bump rattling the windshield. The sky was gray and heavy, sunlight only slipping through the canopy in broken fragments, painting the woods in shifting patches of shadow. The property's owner, an old man, admitted his family rarely set foot there anymore. The reason was obvious. The roads had collapsed into ruin, and the terrain itself was unforgiving, steep ridges, deep gullies, all hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves. To us, though, that isolation was exactly the draw. What I didn't know then was that the wilderness we saw as freedom was hiding something no warning could have prepared us for. The real lure was the emptiness. No trails, no cabins, nothing man-made for 10 miles in any direction, just untouched forest, stretching endlessly like a labyrinth. When I stepped out of the truck, I listened. Aside from the wind threading through the trees and the crunch of our boots sinking into damp leaves, there was nothing. The sight was beautiful and unsettling all at once. Uneven ground, roots jutting out like the ribs of some buried giant, the canopy above swallowing nearly all daylight, leaving only thin strands of light trickling down like threads. Mark laughed, calling it a hunter's paradise, a place stripped of every artificial sound. But in that suffocating quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching us. We had driven in with 2 pickups, beds packed with tents, rifles, and a week's worth of food. The engines thundered against the empty hills before dying away, leaving us swallowed by silence once again. Only the wind in the branches and the faint rush of water somewhere nearby remained. We set camp by a narrow stream, its clear water reflecting the dim gray light of the sky. Mark, as always, insisted on order our tents arranged in a defensive arc, half-circle around the fire pit. Each one stood like a tiny fortress facing the yawning dark of the woods beyond. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, daylight vanished fast, leaving the sky the color of cold steel. The campfire crackled to life, sending sparks into the air and washing our faces in flickering light. In that glow, I realized how small we truly were, our little camp of 4 no more than a fragile spark, floating in an endless sea of darkness. Once the tents were up, Mark snapped us into order. Every piece of gear, from rifles and ammunition to food and flashlights, was laid out and inspected with care. I still remember the sharp, metallic sound of bolts locking into place as we tested each weapon, making sure nothing could fail. Mark laid down strict rules. No one left camp without telling the others. Every trip beyond the perimeter had to be in pairs, and weapons stayed ready at all times. The hunting grounds were split into 4 sectors, each of us responsible for one. We used handheld radios to stay connected, all tuned to the same channel, signals checked before dark set in. The radio crackled in my hand during a test call. Copy? Copy. Such a small sound in the vast silence, but it gave me a sense of comfort. At the time, I thought discipline would keep us safe. Looking back, I can only shudder those very rules would be stripped away by the forest itself, piece by piece, like some cruel game. The first days passed in near-perfect calm. By day, we split into pairs and moved across steep ridges and dense timber. Our boots pressed into damp leaves, and the snap of safety switches echoed in the stillness only to be swallowed instantly, as if the woods refused to hold on to our noise. By night, we circled the fire again. The flames painted our faces in shifting shades of orange and red. Beer cans hissed open, the smoke of roasting meat tangled with the resin of burning wood. We swapped stories about jobs, families, and childhood memories, our laughter breaking through the vast dark of the forest. For a moment, our friendship blazed brighter than the night around us. But now, thinking back, I know that sense of safety was nothing more than a fragile shell. Beyond the firelight, the woods were still watching, quiet, patient, waiting to reveal their true nature. We had set up a few trail cameras around camp, meant to track game. On the 3rd night, when we checked the memory cards, a chill ran through me. There they were, a series of blurred images, capturing the outline of a figure, standing just at the edge of the frame. Tall, thin, no details visible, just a dark silhouette cutting against the black woods. In another frame, the shape tilted its head, as if staring straight into the lens. No flashlight beam, no glint of metal from tools or weapons, just a solid, unmoving shadow, silent, patient, watching. My heart pounded as I showed the group. Mark frowned, then let out a quiet sigh. Probably just a trespasser, or someone camping out, he muttered. But his eyes slid away as he said it. Even though he tried to sound steady, I could feel the tension seeping into every pause afterward, as if we all silently knew something wasn't right. In the days that followed, we kept checking the trail cameras, and the fear no longer came from one lone figure. Every memory card, every angle, showed faint shapes more than one, moving in different places. One frame caught a figure standing motionless behind a tree line to the north. Another, from the south, showed a shape bent low, as if inspecting the ground. One night, 3 cameras fired at once, capturing dark forms shifting in from multiple directions. No flashlights, no sound, just the steady presence of people who seemed so at home in the darkness they had become part of it. I swallowed hard looking at those images. This wasn't chance. It wasn't some drifter passing through. This was coordinated, intentional. Mark was quiet longer than usual before snapping the laptop shut, signaling not to talk further. That silence only weighed heavier, because deep down we all understood. We weren't alone in these woods. By Thursday, the truth was undeniable. On our way back through a familiar hunting area, we found footprints stamped into the damp soil. Mixed in with our boot tracks were bare human prints, long, thin, each toe pressed deep like someone had been pacing right alongside us, unseen. Back at camp, Jeff noticed something worse. A tree near the old shack was marked with fresh gouges, deep scratches carved down its trunk. I brushed my fingers across them. The edges were sharp enough to sting my skin. Then the smell hit, a pungent, almost sour odor, half like raw meat, half like rotting leaves. Instinct screamed at me to step away. No one dared speak it aloud, but the sense of being watched had sunk into every step we took. Every time the wind stirred the treetops, I felt dozens of unseen eyes tracking us through the black. The next morning, Jeff called us over behind the shack. Tucked against a large tree was a crude blind, branches and brush pulled together into a hiding spot. Inside were traces, a gnawed bone, torn food wrappers, the faint ashes of a fire long cold. I knelt down, hand trembling as I touched the soft, blackened dirt. Whoever had been here hadn't just stopped by. They had stayed long enough to watch us without being seen. That discovery changed everything. The air between us tightened. Brian, usually the quiet one, suddenly snapped. He started pacing, his breath ragged. "We need to get out of here. I'm not kidding, someone's tracking us, messing with us." His voice broke, his hands clenching the rifle so hard, his knuckles turned white. Mark tried to hold it together, doing his best to reassure us, but I knew we all felt the same. The thin layer of safety we had was cracking. From the moment we discovered that hidden blind, the forest stopped being hunting ground. It had turned into a stage, and we had become the hunted. While Brian was nearly unraveling, Mark kept his usual calm. He crossed his arms, voice low but firm. "Don't blow this out of proportion. It's probably just poachers drifting through. In woods like these, that's not unusual." He tried to steady us, reminding everyone we had rules, we had weapons, and we knew how to defend ourselves. His words landed sharp and certain, but I noticed something new in his eyes, not confidence, but a flash of unease, gone as quickly as it appeared. We nodded, pretending to accept it for the sake of peace, but the air between us turned heavy as lead. Mark's reassurance felt like a paper wall, thin, fragile, meant to hide what we all already knew. Whatever circled out there in the trees wasn't just poachers. They were organized, they were waiting, and they weren't in any hurry. That day we split up to hunt as usual, but when we came back to camp that afternoon, my stomach dropped. The tents stood exactly as we left them, ropes still tight, but inside, something was wrong. My pack had been opened. Dried food, a knife, a box of rounds, everything had been shifted. Not rummaged through in a rush, placed back carefully, some items even arranged more neatly than before, as if whoever touched them knew exactly what they were for and wanted us to know it. Jeff swore he had locked his pack. Brian stood frozen, eyes darting across the tents like he expected someone to step out of the trees at any second. I drew a deep breath, but the chill racing up my spine caught in my throat. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen, just a silent intrusion, mocking us. Someone had walked through our camp in broad daylight, laid hands on our gear, then vanished as if they'd never been there at all. And somehow, that was worse than a direct attack. That night, as we went through the supplies piece by piece, the truth hit like ice water. Not everything had been touched just to rattle us. Some things were gone for good. Our flares, the handheld GPS, and the only satellite device Mark had brought. Every item that could call for help or guide us out, gone. They hadn't taken food, or guns, or ammo. Only the things that tied us to the outside world. Whoever they were, they knew exactly what to cut away, and they left everything else behind, like a message etched into the silence. "You're under control now. There is the steward." I felt my stomach tighten, as if a cold hand were squeezing me from the inside. Mark tried to keep his voice steady, but even he couldn't deny what this meant. This wasn't chance. This wasn't petty theft. Someone had planned every move, cutting off our exits, waiting to see how we would react. In that moment, I realized the forest was no longer a refuge or a challenge. It had become a massive trap, and we were caught inside it. The next morning, Tom went to check the truck and shouted for us. I ran over, and the sight froze me in place. All 4 tires had been slashed. Not the obvious kind of puncture, but thin, deep cuts, hidden in the grooves of the rubber. I dropped to my knees, running my fingers along the tier. It was sharp and clean, far too precise to be an accident. We had heard nothing the night before. No footsteps around the truck. Just these silent, deliberate wounds. Each one fatal. My pulse hammered as I stared at the truck, listing to one side, completely useless. The only road out of the forest gone. Jeff muttered a curse under his breath. Brian's face drained to ash. Mark tried to stay composed, but for the first time, I saw his hand tremble against the frame. Whoever was out there, or more accurately, they weren't trying to scare us off. They wanted to keep us here. And from that moment on, our little camp became a cage. The forest itself, the walls holding us in, looking at the clean cuts on the tires, remembering the missing flares, the GPS, the satellite device, the realization set in cold and clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't a wanderer stumbling through camp. Every move had been too precise, too calculated. We were up against people who knew exactly how to disable a group in the deep woods. Sever communication, block escape, then watch. Each step had the stamp of a strategy, someone who knew how to hunt, not just animals, but people. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat running down my back despite the chill in the air. Whoever was behind this wanted us to understand we'd been forced into their game, and now it was only a matter of when they chose to act. Mark kept talking tough, but in the eyes of the others I saw the same realization I felt. We weren't hunters anymore. We were prey. That night, we checked the trail cameras again, and the blood drained from my face. No longer just a few blurred figures. The screens showed groups of people moving in formation around our camp. They made no sound, carried no lights, just walked in silence, evenly spaced like a patrol. Their clothing was ragged hides, caked in mud, as if they hadn't touched the outside world in years. In their hands were crude weapons, wooden spears, stone axes, long sharpened sticks. Frame after frame showed how naturally they moved in the dark, their eyes blank, but their steps steady and deliberate. This wasn't a lost group or disorganized poachers. This was a community that had lived in isolation for a very long time, surviving by cutting themselves off from the outside world. And now, they had closed their circle around us. I sat frozen, my heartbeat pounding heavy inside my chest. A chilling thought gripped me. From the very beginning, we hadn't wandered into empty wilderness. We had walked straight into their territory. That afternoon, while skirting the edge of the forest looking for tracks, Brian called out. His voice shook, unlike anything I'd heard from him before. I walked over and saw him clutching a handful of crumpled, filthy papers. They were ID cards, hunting licenses, even old vehicle registrations, yellowed with age. As I flipped through them, I recognized names and faces of people who clearly weren't from our group. Some had issue dates only a few years old. No one said it aloud, but the truth was undeniable. Other groups had been here and never made it out. These scraps had been left scattered like silent proof, deliberately stashed under a rotting log, like trophies or warnings. Brian cursed, threw the stack to the ground, and staggered back, clutching his head, his face as pale as chalk. I stood motionless, a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. If those people had disappeared, whose turn was it now? When Brian dropped the papers, Mark's composure finally cracked. He straightened, his voice firm and final. That's it. We're done. We're leaving now. No one argued. Hunting wasn't on anyone's mind anymore. All we wanted was to get out of those woods as fast as possible. But deep inside, I carried a gnawing certainty. Everything that had happened so far proved the others had already planned for this moment. And I was right. As we began packing, we found the trails outblocked. Freshly felled logs stretched across the path. Shallow pits had been dug and covered with leaves, enough to snare a careless step. None of it was random. They knew we would try to run. And they had prepared for it, like patient hunters waiting for desperate prey to walk into the trap. By Friday night, sleep was impossible. We sat around the fire, rifles across our laps, eyes locked on the dark. That's when the sounds began. At first, it was just the rustle of dry leaves, easy to mistake for wind. But minutes later, I heard it clearly. Footsteps. Not one. Many. They moved around us, sometimes close, sometimes far, circling tighter with every pass. Each crunch of leaves made my heart jolt, my sweat-slicked hands gripping the stock of my gun until it hurt. Then came the voices. At first, they sounded like faint whispers, broken and scattered through the trees. But as I listened closer, I realized the tones were warped, mixed with low howls that echoed like wild animals. The sounds overlapped, coming from every direction, sometimes close, sometimes distant, until my head spun. Jeff clamped his hands over his ears, mumbling prayers. Brian shook uncontrollably, eyes darting everywhere. I just stared beyond the firelight, into the thick blackness that swallowed every shape. The feeling was undeniable. They were out there, only a few steps away, deliberately refusing to show themselves. That night, the forest stopped being a place. It became a stage of horrors, where we were forced to listen to voices that weren't fully human, but not quite animal either. After the footsteps and the twisted voices, they changed tactics. The fire had burned low when the first thud landed a heavy rock crashing to the ground just inches from my boot. Then more whiz, crack, branches, stones of all sizes, and even damp, foul-smelling lumps of organic matter hurled with precision into the middle of camp. Not a single throw missed. Not one struck to injure. Everything landed squarely where we could see it, as if to prove they could do far worse anytime they chose. The stench rose sharp and sour, mixing with smoke and sweat, making me gag. Jeff cursed under his breath. Brian was nearly in tears. I sat rigid, heart hammering, eyes locked on the black outside the ring of light. We never saw anyone, only objects appearing out of nowhere, sailing through the night and hitting the ground with eerie accuracy. The worst part wasn't the danger itself, it was the certainty. We were being watched, tested, worn down piece by piece until our nerves finally gave out. Between the crashes of rocks, the snap of branches, and the reek flooding camp, they would sometimes stop completely, Silence fell total and crushing. No footsteps, no warped voices, nothing. That silence was what broke me most. We sat stiff around the dying fire, eyes straining into the dark. I could hear every heartbeat pounding in my ears, Brian's ragged breathing, and the slick sound of sweat on my palms sliding over the stock of my rifle. Nothing is more terrifying than knowing someone is out there, but not what they're doing, where they're standing, or how close they really are. That silence was worse than the harassment itself. It was like a game, with us as prey being toyed with, until despair set in. Each time the silence ended, another throw crashed into camp, sharp and deliberate, as if to remind us, we're still here, and you're not going anywhere. By the end of that Friday night, we all knew. If we stayed, sooner or later, they would walk straight into the firelight. The only chance was escape not as hunters on a getaway, but using every ounce of training we had ever learned just to survive. All four of us had military backgrounds. Mark had served as infantry, and the rest of us had gone through basic training when we were younger. Now, every bit of that experience had to be used not for drills, but for survival. Mark quickly assumed command. He broke us into a combat formation, 2 sweeping the front, 2 covering the rear. Flashlights were kept to a minimum to avoid giving away our position. Instead, we relied on the terrain we'd memorized and silent hand signals. Radios were still with us, but transmissions had to be brief and quiet, just enough to confirm contact without being detected. In the flicker of the dying fire, I looked at each face drained, tense, but with the same hard resolve in their eyes. We weren't just friends on a hunting trip anymore. We had become a small unit, surrounded in enemy ground, with only 2 outcomes: break out or never return. At first light on Saturday, the forest turned silver gray under the rising Sunday. We abandoned camp, stripped down to light packs, weapons ready, and stepped into the formation Mark had set. The goal was the service road 12 miles away. If we could reach it, we might have a chance. But the forest pushed back from the very start. Fallen trees blocked the paths, fresh cuts oozing sap proved they had been placed deliberately. More than once, we thought we'd found a way out, only to realize the trails were false, narrow tracks leading straight into shallow pits covered with leaves, or looping us back to where we'd started. Sweat poured down my face, my heart racing out of rhythm. Every step felt heavier, not just from fatigue but from the sick knowledge that none of this was random. Someone had laid out the ground ahead of us like a chessboard, and we were being herded across it. Mark kept signaling us to hold formation, but I could hear Jeff's ragged breathing behind me, and Brian mumbling that we'd never make it out. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Dawn hadn't brought relief. It had only revealed the truth. The entire forest had become a cage, and we were trapped inside it. After 8 grueling hours pushing through the woods, exhausted, disoriented, nearly broken, we finally saw it. The service road. A strip of open dirt cut like a narrow escape route through the wall of green. We almost collapsed when a maintenance truck appeared, its hazard lights flashing in the fading daylight. The driver looked at us with suspicion, but still loaded us in and drove us out of there. At the ranger station, we filed a detailed report. Missing gear, slashed tires, footprints, trail cam photos, every detail logged. What we got in return was a vague promise to look into it. No official warning. No urgent response. It was as if the authorities had heard it all before. 6 months later, just as I was starting to push it out of my mind, I read the news. 2 more hunting parties had gone missing in the same region. A few staggered back, shaken to their core, telling stories almost identical to ours. We swore never to return. And from that day forward, whenever anyone mentions the deep woods of the Appalachians, I only have one warning. There are communities still out there hidden, closed off, organized, and they will never let intruders walk away easily.